My name's Nicholas Aroney. I've met one or two of you. I'm not known to many of you else, but I'm chairing the session today, and it's a real privilege. And today we're going to have each person, our wonderful three speakers, each speak individually and have questions immediately after each paper. And so we're going to proceed in that way. So they'll each speak for 20 minutes. We'll have 10 minutes for questions for that paper and so forth. So not to waste any of their time. Our first speaker is Stefanus Hendrianto, who is a Jesuit priest and legal scholar. He's a member of the USA West Province of the Society of Jesus. In recent years, he served as a lecturer at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Currently, he's a Waite Chair, visiting professor at Creighton University's School of Law in Omaha, Nebraska. His research interests include the intersection of law, theology, and philosophy. His paper is entitled, intriguingly, very interesting, The Constitution of Heaven and Hell, Thomas Aquinas on Worship through Law, Justice, and Constitutional Government. Thank you. Please welcome.
So thank you for everyone for being here today on this last day of the conference and the last hour of this conference. And I apologize in advance to all of you that I may have to leave earlier today also, and also to all my panelists here, because I have to catch my flight tonight from Chicago. So I'm sorry for that, but I will stay for a little while here, I think that for Q&A and stuff like that. So my paper is titled The Constitution of Heaven and Hell, Aquinas on Worship through Justice, Law, and Justice and Constitutional Government. So let me begin with his treatise on law, in which Aquinas began with the proposition, law is a rule and measure of acts, whereby man is induced to act or is restrained from acting, for lex is derived from ligare, because it binds one to act. This is from Prima Secundae, question 90, article 1. So there are two terms here, lex and ligare. You already know, I think, that the term lex is used to define different kinds of law in treatises of law. So from lex aeterna, lex naturalis, lex humana, and lex divina. But then now he used the different terms also to associate lex, which is, ligare. It just means to bind. This idea is not new because Latin Christianity in the Middle Ages used the term lex to designate what the modern people call religion today. So for Aquinas, lex associated with worship in the sense that it's derived from the term ligare. In Summa Contra Gentiles, he wrote that the divine worship also called religion because by this acts man ligat himself, as it were, lest he stray from God. And he took this actually from St. Augustine in De Vera Religione, when he said, let our religion then bind us tight to the one Almighty God. So having established lex is closely associated with religion and worship, Aquinas explained now that lex is fundamentally associated with human reason. Reason stands as the principle of action because it directs human being to the way to the end. So for Aquinas, the object of practical reason is about the end, the final end of human life, which is happiness. So as law is closely associated with the finality of human happiness, individual happiness, then must be ordained toward the common happiness. And this come, I think his famous dictum, this all law is ordered toward common good. So for Aquinas, the orientation toward common good is essentially the definition of lex. So now I think the premise is that lex is ordained by reason for the common good. Then he began to explain that different kind of laws. He began with eternal law. Aquinas treated eternal law here in the context of God's governance. God's governance of his creation. God governed the world through the eternal law by actively directing creation to the end. So it is the eternal law that brings all the creation to its proper end. So for Aquinas, through eternal law, God sustained the creation by directing them in the proper relationship with him. And one of this is through the order of worship. But the order of creation is limited due to human weakness. So, in some ways, that God has to intervene. So, eternal law has to deal with rational creature, and reason must conform itself to God. But human reason cannot sufficiently order human action toward God because human weakness that caused by sin. And God must intervene here in different way, and one intervention is through the order of worship, as it is most direct way leading man to God. The worship will help instill a right reason in human creatures, and worship will provide the soul with capacity to act in proper manner toward God. The worship will help human creatures toward happiness by providing the graces necessary to achieve supernatural happiness. And the order of worship will eventually lead human beings toward happiness as their end, which manifested in participation in God's eternal law. The rational creature participation in God's eternal law, which Aquinas called as the natural law. Natural law serves a foundation of all action, including worship. But while natural law will not guide every human action, it will provide the first direction to the participation in eternal law. So natural law becomes foundation of worship that order human reasons and will toward God. But natural law is also limited because it doesn't prescribe any directive, but only general principle. So since natural law is limited, each individual must decide on each particular issue, make choices based on general principle of natural law. And this is same thing happened with the order of worship. While the foundation of worship derived from natural law, it must be added that some practical determination concerning that the mode of worship. So natural law does not direct to a particular rule of worship, so they need additional law to supplement it. And here this comes of the divine law and human law. So let's start first with human law. Aquinas' view in human law is, in the context of worship, is somewhat limited because he explained like this. This is quotation from Prima Secundae, question 99, article 3. He said, human law have not concerned themselves with the institutions of anything relating to divine worship, except as affecting the common good of mankind. So human law is limited in directing worship because they cannot achieve eternal happiness. But human law can contribute to the order of worship by pointing out the common good as something beyond natural happiness. But the question is now whether, at the very least, human law has a duty to foster religion. Aquinas believe here there's a limit of human law in fostering religion, because sin will make many earthly rulers to confine religion within their sole authority. Actually, it led corruption of worship, because they will pursue material good instead of the final common good. For the reason, Aquinas argued that we need divine law to help to ensure human legislator to see natural law more clearly. So the divine law has responsibility in relation to human law to guide toward eternal happiness. So the rule of worship established by divine law is become more apparent in the Decalogue. Aquinas explained that God first made clear the principle of worship through the moral precepts. The moral precept will specify the necessity of worship, and after it is clear, then God must be how God will be worshipped. It will accomplish this moral precept will be specified in the ceremonial precept. So in the first tablet of the Decalogue, God promulgated the moral precepts and the role of worship. The first tablet includes recognition on the need to worship God, and this worship due to one God alone. And finally, there's proper way to worship God. You shall not make yourself an idol. You shall not invoke the name of the Lord in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So the first tablet of Decalogue specified the foundation of true worship by prescribing how one should worship God. Here now I think that afterward Aquinas gave the detail of how to worship, I think, in the ceremonial precept. He discussed about the sacrifice, and then discussed about the tabernacle, the temple, the space of sacrifice, I'm not going into detail because I don't have time here. The bottom line is that all the detailed ceremonial precepts intended to bring a proper relation to God by uniting one soul to God to the end, which is to the beatific visions. Then the second tablet of worship, according to Aquinas, is related to the order of justice. This is quotation from Prima Secundae, question 110, Article 8. Quote, the precept of second tablet contain the order of justice to be observed among men, that nothing undue be done to anyone, that each one be given his due. So it is in this sense we are able to take precepts of the Decalogue, close quote. So now I will move to the order of justice now. The issue is quite complex and is being discussed in this conference for many different speakers. I'm not going into detail, especially relationship between lex and ius. There's something I want to highlight in the Treaty of Justice. Aquinas highlight the both distinction and unity between lex and ius. Lex, in external sense, is distinct concept than ius. But in the internal sense, there's unity between lex and ius as object of justice. So based on this connection between lex and ius, Aquinas then described this both lex and ius have commonality leading people toward the common good. So here I think that in the context of worship, justice is meant to promote the right relation between individuals for the flourishing of the communal life and relationship to God. Basically, worship is essential for the well-being of the city. Aquinas argues that the justice properly orders individual toward the common good, but justice orders individual not only for the common good in the communal life, but also toward their final end. So Aquinas' treatment of justice and worship become more apparent in his explanation on sacrifice in the context of justice. Aquinas began asking a question whether an act of offering sacrifice falls within natural law or some specific type of lex. His answer is yes, it falls within the natural law. Sacrifice derived originally from natural law, but it might be corrupted by sin. So sin may corrupt natural law, which eventually sever the foundation of worship, in which the act of sacrifice may find its way into this distorted practice of idolatry. So he asked a question whether sacrifice should be offered to God alone. Here he used different analogy from governmental practice. People show sign of honor and respect to the sovereign ruler. But if the same honor and respect shown to anyone else outside the kingdom or to different sovereign, then this act can be deemed as an act of treason. So Aquinas concluded that in the divine law, the death punishment is assigned to those who offer divine honor to another than God. This is from Secundae, question 85, article 2. So the practice of idolatry here help us to understand the connection between worship and justice and common good. Aquinas explained there are many reasons of idolatry. I'm not going into detail, just one of them. He said that the current ignorance of the true God. So sin leads humanity to their ignorance, and they easily worship man or other gods. So sin will distort the human will and from its proper direction toward God, and will move to another God by pointing toward different God as its end. So disordered will and ignorance lead one to false worship or even refusal to worship God. Distortion of worship will pose a significant threat to moral life of the city and also to God. Because when they have disordered will, they will contend against God by violating the 10 Commandments. Not only the first tablet, but also second tablet. When human beings show their contempt, violating God's commandment, they will seek to destroy the common good, not only injuring communal life, but also injuring God. So by adopting the approach that religion is aligned with justice, Aquinas argues here, religion cannot be conceived as private and personal experience, But religion, as integral component of justice, must be governed by laws. And religion cannot be separated from the legal framework. Ultimately, there's close connections also here with the governmental practice. For the sake of the time, I think I will just focus here how Aquinas presents the king as the minister Dei. I will use here the Recno and also Summa Theologia. I know that I think that some people were cautious using the Recno, but I'll try my best here. So I'm also talking here about the context of a mixed government as one of the Aquinas' ideal form of government. Of course, there's a debate. I know that whether he really in favor of mixed government or kingship, but keep it for another day. So in the Recno, Aquinas presents the king as minister Dei, a minister of God who govern the people. Here it might be distinguished between minister Dei and minister Ecclesiae. So the king as minister of God is not a servant of the church or theocratic government. As a minister Dei, the king have delicate role in leading human beings toward their final end. Aquinas explained that the king will govern his subject toward the final end only insofar it could be attained by human power or human nature. But of course, that the earthly king cannot fulfill this man's final end because one needs assistance of grace to attain the final end. So it's responsibility of the church. But nevertheless, when the king have duty to promote the good life of the multitude, he never supposed it's only limited to earthly good, because multitude cannot attain the heavenly good by themselves. So the king here at least thinks that in his promotion of the common good must be in line with the pursuit of heavenly fulfillment. So the king must prescribe whatever things lead to heavenly fulfillment and forbid those to contrary to attainment ultimate end. In Summa Theologia, Aquinas say that the king as minister Dei has the power to prosecute, to execute wrath upon those who does evil. Here, the king as minister Dei executing God's justice. The king executed God's justice not as a mini God or a new God, but rather than he one who served justice on behalf of God. So the power of punishment here are things that related to the common good. Because I think Aquinas argued that public authority has authority to do, it's lawful to kill an evildoer insofar as direct the welfare of the whole community. So here are things that the king has given authority for the sake of common good to punish those who threaten the common good and rendering a death sentence to preserve the common good of the city. So this logic can be used also in the context of salvation. Aquinas argued in the same way that God antecedently wills all men to be saved, but consequently wills someone to be damned, as his justice exacts. This is from Prima Pars, question 19. So now, in the context of salvation here now, I think that God permit the existence of hell for the sake of common good. God desire everyone to be saved, but for the sake of common good of the universe, God must punish those who committed sins, and hell serve as manifestation of God's justice, his hatred for sins by punishing the sinners in eternal damnation. So, in heaven, here is perfect participation of common good that God intends for us. In heaven, we will participate in the common good of the whole universe by having union with the ultimate common good is God itself. While those in hell also participate in common good in the sense they must accept separation from God for the sake of common good. So salvation of individual being subordinated for the common good of the universe, because when they committed sin, they will damn for the sake of common good of universe. So God permit eternal damnations for the sake of common good of universe. This group of people populate hell will participate in common good in different way that we imagined before. At least they must sacrifice and give up their salvations for the sake of the new heaven and the new earth.
Well, thank you very much. Time for questions. Anyone? I'll bring this microphone around, so please put your hand up if you've got a question. what if I open? Oh, no, we have one there.
Thank you so much, Father. Just to maybe go a little more specific, and maybe you said this and I wasn't paying as much attention as I should have, but so if it's the king's responsibility to try to determine the natural law, and that includes the the directive towards natural worship of God, like what sort of laws should a king pass, and like promoting true natural religion, and like what would be the limits on that? I mean, this is basically the integralism question. So,
anti-integralism questions. Okay, thank you for the questions. Here are things that, as I mentioned before, where there are things that is responsibility for the early government to promote, to foster religions. Aquinas' position is, I think, that it's not really, I mean, the duty of the king, or here, I think, to foster religions, because he said it is actually responsibility of the church. But in the context of promulgating human law, which is the role of the early government, here I think the law at least should not hinder the religion in some way. So I think his answer is it can be limited. The human law have the limited role. Yeah, of course, the role of the king mostly for the human law. Although he argued that actually in direct no, so that the king also must understand about the divine law, but doesn't mean that the early king has implemented that, because it's not the context of theocratic state here. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Other questions? I have a question, if I may, as a chair. I hear a lot of echoes of Augustine in the argument that you present as an exposition of Thomas. Particularly, I'm thinking of the way in which Augustine said that the Roman Republic never had justice because it didn't give the due worship to God. And it struck me that it would be an interesting question to determine to what extent is Thomas reflecting Augustinian themes here? To what extent is he going further than Augustine? To what extent is he drawing back from Augustine? And perhaps Augustine's attitude to the Donatists might be an example, although I'm not sure how to connect the two precisely, because it's not exactly the same question Augustine's asking. Do you have any thoughts on the relationship between Augustine and Thomas Aquinas on this point?
Yes, it's obvious that I think he rely a lot on Augustine here. I think that in the context of worship and justice. And also in the beginning, in my explanation of Lex, I think that the idea of law and religion is closely connected is also derived from Augustine. And also I think the role of worship that in the context of justice, I think that here Augustine also I think that in some way is I think that he derived also from Cicero, because the one argument he said the well-being of the city is depend on the worship, actually derived from Cicero, and then was a Republican, I think that in the time of Cicero. So yeah, I think I didn't have a chance to explain more details about the roles in Augustine here, but I think if you read the Summa Theologia, Treaty of Justice, that he cited a lot, St. Augustine, and of course, like I'm not professional theologian in some ways, but some theologian has debated many years. I think that until the kingdom come, already the differences between Aquinas and Augustine. But in some way, as we know, that he cited a lot of Augustine in Summa, especially also in this context of worship and justice. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions? I can't resist but have another one, but I want to give you, the audience, an opportunity to ask any other questions. It's quite an intriguing thought that there would be a constitution of hell. And I think you were fairly careful to explain what that might mean. But the interesting question about that is that do you think that the concept of a constitution, one might have thought in a Thomistic sense, is certainly something that is the constitution of a community dedicated to the common good. So I suppose, are you being slightly mischievous in speaking of the constitution of hell? Do you really mean just specifically what you said, and that is that those destined to hell are there so as to, as it were, I took you to be saying, maintain the purity of heaven, as it were, in the common good of heaven, in a suppose in a negative sense. Is that the extent to which there's a constitution in hell, or is there more to it than that? And does that have any relationship to the constitutions of this day and age where they can be both heavenly and a bit hellish?
Yeah, of course, that when we talk about constitutions, we tend to think about written constitutions that, like in the modern context or modern liberal constitutions. But of course, I think we know that in the time of even Aristotle, kind of like that, when he talked about constitution, he didn't talk about, the written constitution that we have today. And also in the Aquinas time, I think that he doesn't, talk about written constitution like what we have now. So when I use the term this constitution, mostly I think how that the universe has been governed. Of course, this is last part of my, presentation. I did not have time to elaborate that. But what as I said before, I think that for the sake of the universe here, I think the governor of the universe, God, back to eternal law in the beginning, God ordered the creation of the universe here. I think that in that context also, I think that, as Aquinas explained, that God wants everybody to be safe, but in the end that he make the tough decision. So in that context, I think there's a governmental decision from the creator here, I think, which is God, and I think in the make the parallelisms with in the constitutional context. Of course, it's not a written constitution, but inside hell itself, that whether they govern by constitutions that or not, constitution of hell, that I don't think so. And then Aquinas didn't ever specific about that. But in the context of universe, that's why I said the analogy here. There's a constitution of heaven and hell, in which the God in the end that make the decision for the sake of the common good universe. The some will be damned, some will be saved.
Thank you. I'm trying to shake my memory of Dante as we talk, but another question here.
Thank you, Father, for the talk. I'm really interested in, so you say that like the common good is, and the end of all humans is human happiness, and those in hell are participating in the common good by sacrificing their salvation. So I'm wondering if those in hell are experiencing any aspect of happiness because of this sacrifice and because of their participation in the common good, or that how does happiness exist in hell for them?
All right, thank you. This is an interesting question, because I think that for those people in hell, I think they first they may not realize also. That contribute to the common good in different ways. I think common good of universe I'm talking about here. I think that so they may contribute. That indirectly here. I think that and whether they achieve their own happiness in hell, I think that means that because when they decided to choose certain path, I think this is what they believe as the good that they believe in. So I think that when they ended up in hell, I think that the consequences of their choice. In the end, I think that's the good, whether they're really happy or not. I think that means that sorry, but that's their choice, which is they believe as the good. So I think the happiness, not in the context of maybe human happiness or the supernatural happiness they experience, but in certain sense, I think they find their own happiness because I think they get what they want. They're the one who make their choice.
Any last questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Feel free to leave when you need to. But it's good that you can stay as much as you can.
Yeah.
Well, it's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Tyler Castle, who's the Associate Director of the Centre for Citizenship and Constitutional Government and a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Notre Dame. His dissertation explores the philosophical grounding for political moderation within the Christian intellectual tradition, focusing on the thought of Augustine, Blaise Pascal, and Alexis de Tocqueville. His paper today is entitled What Holds Us Together? Aquinas on Affable Citizenship, and what a timely topic that is. Thank you. Please welcome him.
Well, thank you, Nicholas, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'll try to get this out of the way here. So yeah, as Nicholas insinuated, and as you all may know, we live in a divided, fractious society, in America especially, but in other places too. In light of this, it has become commonplace to hear calls for greater civility. Do any of you think we need more civility? Anybody? A couple? Okay, the rest of you I'm staying away from on social media. These calls for civility are relatively uncontroversial on their face, but they become more complicated when you dig a bit more deeply. First, there isn't agreement about what civility actually entails. Is it no more than mere civility, as Teresa Bejan puts it, a willingness to simply tolerate, even contemptuously, those with whom we disagree? Or should it be situated within a more robust conception of civic friendship? Second, it's difficult to know what the limits of civility are, if there even are any. Is the mandate to behave civilly with each other a categorical imperative, or are there instances in which uncivil behavior may be appropriate? Finally, civility has come under fire from both the left and the right in recent decades. Radical left critics like Wendy Brown view civility as a covert tool of establishment liberals to subordinate, oppress, and perpetuate an unjust status quo. Meanwhile, other more subdued critics argue that civility is simply too weak, too ineffectual to address the serious problems facing our society. So in light of our society's growing divisions, as well as these issues and complications with the concept of civility, I want to propose in the next few minutes that Thomas Aquinas, this medieval theologian, has something to teach us today about the public sentiments and practices that are required to hold societies together. My goal is to convince you that his virtue of affability is more grounded, more robust, and also more attainable than the various conceptions of civility that are offered by contemporary theorists. Okay, so before I get to Aquinas, let's briefly discuss a few contemporary accounts of civility. First, as already mentioned, Teresa Bejan proposed a slimmed-down version of civility in 2017, inspired by the Puritan Roger Williams. Mere civility, Bejan explains, consists of no more than a minimal adherence to culturally contingent rules of respectful behavior, compatible with and occasionally expressive of contempt for others and their beliefs. Mere civility, she writes, if indeed it is a virtue, is one governing relations with ex-spouses and bad neighbors, as well as members of the opposing party or sect. Bejan is implicitly responding to the radical left critics of civility here. Whereas thicker conceptions of civility either stifle disagreement or are exclusionary, labeling certain individuals and groups as uncivil and unfit for inclusion in society, mere civility encourages disagreement. It ensures no one is silenced or forced to conform. For Bejan, mere civility's virtue lies in its ability to coexist with and even communicate our contempt for others' most fundamental commitments while continuing the conversation. Although she makes a noble attempt to rescue civility from its fiercest critics, I argue that Bejan's prescription is simply not enough to hold societies together. At best, mere civility is likely to result in the continued ghettoization of society into ideologically homogenous communities and internet echo chambers. After all, in a free society, no one will actively choose to engage with those whom they find contemptuous, unless they are forced to. Another recent but more robust conception of civility comes from Richard Boyd from Georgetown, who argues that civility must be rooted in the mutual recognition of others as our moral equals. For Boyd, civility entails the respectful treatment of others by which we communicate our basic decency and human compassion. Boyd's account of civility and others like it, which I reference in my paper, provide more convincing accounts of what is required to hold societies together. However, I argue that they too are unsatisfactory for at least two reasons. First, nearly all modern secular approaches to civility rest on the assumption that political community is something unnatural and contrived. Civility is therefore a Kantian duty that pushes against our natural inclination toward anti-sociability. If this is true, it should cause us to doubt whether civil behavior could ever be sustained. Second, and relatedly, Boyd argues that classical virtue, Christian ethics, or any other thick shared purposes are as exclusionary as they are demanding, implying there's no place for them in modern pluralistic societies. The problem, though, is that without some broader framework of natural law or natural justice, civility becomes whatever one wants it to be. The boundaries between the civil and the uncivil become arbitrary, as civility's critics argue, and we have no real way to determine when uncivil behavior might be appropriate. echoing Alistair MacIntyre, who Notre Dame folks know well and love. By connecting civility from the virtue tradition, it becomes hollow and fragmented, more language than substance. Finally, Stephen Carter and Anne Hartle offer similarly robust conceptions of civility, but they make the opposite mistake by arguing that civility can only be maintained in a religious culture. Carter claims that only religion possesses the majesty, the power, and the sacred language to teach all of us, the religious and secular, the genuine appreciation for each other on which a successful civility must rest. Likewise, Hartle argues that the respect for and recognition of the dignity of the individual that are essential for civility can only be found in the sacred tradition. Ironically, much like modern liberals, Carter and Hartle seem to believe that human nature is inherently antisocial, apart from religion. With these conceptions of civility as a backdrop, let's now dive into Aquinas. Aquinas does not directly discuss the virtue of affability until question 114 of the Secundus Secundae. Most people don't get that far, but he alludes to it in his discussion of the natural law in question 94 of the Prima Secundae. There, Aquinas famously describes the most basic precepts of the natural law, which flow from its first indemonstrable principle, which is that good is to be done and pursued and evil is to be avoided. As this principle relates to the human person's distinctly human nature, Aquinas writes, quote, "Man has a natural inclination to know the truth about God and to live in society. In this respect, whatever pertains to this inclination belongs to the natural law. For instance, to shun ignorance, to avoid offending those among whom one has to live, and other such things regarding the above inclination," unquote. Aquinas makes three crucial points here. First, sociability is one of the most distinctive and fundamental human characteristics. Aquinas agrees with Aristotle that human beings are innately political animals. Second, and flowing from the first, it is vital to the flourishing of human society that people avoid offending each other, a point he will elaborate upon in his discussion of affability. And third, human beings are naturally inclined to act in such an unoffensive way. For Aquinas, all precepts of the natural law are aligned with the natural inclinations of human beings, which means they are not Kantian duties pushing against our innate tendencies. This implies, of course, that supernatural grace is not absolutely required for human beings to behave virtuously. Aquinas certainly believes that grace would help, especially in light of sin, as would social conditions that are conducive to virtue, but he is relatively optimistic about human nature. He expects that people will generally, though not always, act affably towards one another. Okay, but what is affability exactly? Affability is a virtue which is annexed to the virtue of justice, but does not have the same binding quality as justice. Aquinas explains that it regards merely a certain debt of equity, namely, that we behave pleasantly to those among whom we dwell. He explains further that affability, like liberality, conduces to greater rectitude between people, although without it, rectitude may still be ensured in a formal legal sense. So while affability falls short of justice, it also perfects it in a sense by going beyond the requirements of justice. Expounding on its actual substance, Aquinas writes, quote, "Because a man is a social animal, he owes his fellow man in equity the manifestation of truth without which human society could not last. Now, as man could not live in society without truth, so likewise not without joy, because no one could abide a day with the sad nor with the joyless." We all have that coworker who confirms that truth. Aquinas continues, "Therefore, a certain natural equity obliges a man to live agreeably with his fellow men, unless some reason should oblige him to sadden them for their good," unquote. We see here Aquinas' intuitive understanding of the human person shine forth. From a theoretical perspective, Bejan can argue that treating one another with contempt is not problematic as long as we agree to continue the conversation. But Aquinas knows that when someone treats another person contemptuously, it is natural for that person to avoid contact with them. To be sure, we can point to examples of heroic stoicism in the face of mistreatment, but human relationships, especially on a societal scale, cannot be maintained over the long term without the joy that comes from pleasant, affable behavior. Aquinas goes on to explain the source of this behavior. Every man is naturally every man's friend by a certain general love. As members of the same human family, it is natural for us to love other human beings. However, it is important to note that this is a general love which is distinct from true or perfect friendship. After all, Aquinas clarifies, we do not treat strangers with the same intimacy as those who are united to us by special friendship. He elaborates on this point in his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, where he writes this of affability. Since the virtue is without affection, it differs from true friendship. This is proved by the fact that he observes the same not only with friends, but generally with all acquaintances and strangers, intimates, and outsiders. In addition to appropriately situating affability below true friendship, which is simply too high of a standard for civic relationships, this passage addresses one of the most common practical retorts to calls for civility, which goes something like this. How could I be civil, to say nothing of being friendly toward that person? I can't help but despise them. Aquinas helps us understand why this is no excuse. Affability is not dependent upon the likability of the person with whom we are engaging. It is rather a virtue, a personal virtue, by which a person habitually chooses to act in a friendly manner, despite having no affection for the person with whom they are interacting. So yes, for Aquinas, even that person deserves to be treated affably. Aquinas also points out in these passages that while affability falls short of true friendship, it creates the social conditions in which deeper attachments can be formed. In other words, civic affability or friendliness creates a social environment in which private friendships can flourish. Conversely, that means that when a society lacks the virtue of affability, we can expect social isolation and loneliness to be prevalent. Our modern minds are inclined to separate private and public life, but the reality is that they impact each other profoundly. Okay, so far, so good, perhaps. Hopefully you're staying with me. But one of the complications with civility that we talked about initially has not yet been addressed. Is the mandate to behave civilly or affably absolute? Or are there instances in which harsh speech or treatment is appropriate? And relatedly, does Aquinas have an adequate response to the critics of civility? An answer to these questions was hinted at previously when Aquinas noted that a person may be obliged to sadden another for their good. Aquinas argues that, quote, it belongs to the wise man to share his pleasures with those among whom he dwells, not lustful pleasures, which virtue shuns, but honest pleasures. For this reason, Aquinas continues, we should not show a cheerful face to those who are given to sin, in order that we may please them, lest we seem to consent to their sin and in a way encourage them to sin further, unquote. This, in somewhat antiquated language, is Aquinas' answer to those critics of civility who argue that it condones passive quietism in the face of injustice. He makes clear that the charity we owe to others is not always affirming and agreeable. When our neighbor sins, they deserve to be chastised in truth and love, not greeted with a cheerful, consenting face. But what exactly should this confrontation look like? Aquinas offers guidance in his discussion of fraternal correction in his discourse on charity. There he quotes a lengthy passage from Augustine, quote, when we have to find fault with anyone, we should think whether we were never guilty of his sin. And then we must remember that we are men and might have been guilty of it, or that we once had it on our conscience but have it no longer. And then we should bethink ourselves that we are all weak, in order that our reproof may be the outcome not of hatred but of pity. But if we find that we are guilty of the same sin, we must not rebuke him, but groan with him and invite him to repent with us, unquote. As Augustine beautifully states in this passage, personal humility is absolutely essential to proper fraternal correction, or else it is prone to be self-righteous. Moreover, prudence is also required when correcting another. There are, of course, behaviors that deserve to be punished punitively by a legal authority, but that is not the duty of citizens. Their duty is prudent admonishment. Aquinas notes that when it is deemed probable that the sinner will not take the warning and will become worse, fraternal correction should be foregone, because the means should be regulated according to the requirements of the end. The purpose of fraternal correction, as Aquinas emphasizes here, is the repentance and amendment of the person committing a wrongdoing. It should not be an occasion for the self-righteous corrector to prove their righteousness, which is typically how it is practiced in our contemporary context. As this entire discussion takes for granted, in addition, It is crucial for Aquinas' conception of affability that it exists within a broader moral and ethical framework. For Aquinas, that framework is the natural law by which human beings have an inherent knowledge of and an inclination to the good. Although this proposition is controversial today, it seems apparent that some framework of substantive, universally applicable moral principles is essential to any functioning society. Without them, liberal values like civility and tolerance become ineffective and arbitrary. Okay, so we now have a decent grasp of what Aquinas means by affability. I spent some time in the paper discussing the vices which correlate with affability, flattery, and quarreling, explaining how they highlight the ways in which our contemporary society falls short of the virtue. We have a lot of flatterers and quarrelers. But for the sake of time, I want to conclude by emphasizing why Aquinas' conception of affability, when compared with contemporary conceptions of civility, provides a better way of thinking about what is required to hold societies together. First, Aquinas' virtue of affability does not aim too low. He understands that human decency and pleasantness, rooted in a general love for others, is essential to the maintenance and enjoyment of human society. At the same time, Aquinas does not aim too high either. He does not confuse affability with true friendship, which is an impractical standard for civic relationships. This distinction is important, moreover, because it clarifies that affable behavior is not dependent upon our affection for the other person. Whether it is a stranger or someone who we know and despise, the mandate to treat them decently remains. Second, affability is reflective of the fact that human beings are made for community. Aquinas sees human society and the innate sociability that accompanies it as both natural and essential to human flourishing. Also, because affability is an essential part of the natural law, it is not an exclusive possession of Christians or the religious. This means that there is hope for attaining some level of social concord in religiously and culturally diverse modern societies. Third, Aquinas emphasizes that being affable does not mean we are always passive and agreeable toward our fellow citizens. Harsh treatment of others is appropriate in response to a sin or an injustice. But the critical admonishment that is deserved in these instances must always come from a place of humility and love, intended to build up the person being admonished, not the self-righteous ego of the admonisher. Fourth, while contemporary accounts of civility tend to be philosophically ungrounded and therefore hollow and arbitrary, Aquinas' virtue of affability is situated within a broader moral and ethical framework, though not a sectarian one. This framework is the source of affability's thickness and groundedness, and is also what clarifies its limits. Fifth, and finally, Aquinas rejects the modern divide between private and public life. He recognizes that public virtues and public relationships inevitably affect our private relationships and vice versa. To put it bluntly, in order to be loving spouses, parents, and friends, we must also be affable members of society. So, as the divisions in our society continue to grow, and as the demands for greater civility proliferate in turn, I hope I've convinced you that Aquinas' conception of affability provides a fruitful alternative vision for the public sentiments and practices that are required for those divisions to be imperfectly overcome. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a terrific presentation. Some questions now. Up the back.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. Maybe this is a suggestion more than a question. Have you looked at the commentary of St. Thomas Aquinas to the first part of the 8th book of the Nicomachean Ethics? Because there Aristotle says that friendship is what bonds cities together. And the interesting part there is that he's not saying that he's not saying this in a normative sense. He's not saying that friendship should keep cities together, or that we should be friends to each other, or that we should be affable to each other, but instead he is stating a fact. So people live together, cities hold together because naturally citizens are friends, not because they are personal friends, but because we have a utility friendship, a useful friendship. So we discover, we see that our own good is the same as the good of others. So we become we naturally become partners in this common life, which is the city.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, obviously, in all of this, I have a section at the beginning of my paper before I dive into Aquinas, where I mostly discuss Aristotle's book 4, chapter 6 of the Ethics, which is where he specifically describes this virtue of friendliness. He actually doesn't give a name to the virtue, but he contrasts it with surliness and flattery. And so in a similar way, he's trying to describe this more general type of friendship that one has with a broad array of human associations. And so that's mostly what I focus on. And then as I mentioned in my talk, I discuss a little bit of Aquinas' commentary on that portion of the Ethics. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it might be helpful for me to look at that portion of the Ethics as well. But one of the things that is sort of confusing to the modern reader is that friendship for Aristotle and Aquinas means a lot of different things. You know, they use basically the same word to describe everything from a close, affectionate relationship, true and perfect friendship, you know, oriented towards good and the virtue of the other, to, you know, friendships of utility, friendships of eros, all sorts of different things. And so part of the reason why the translation of affability sometimes is friendliness or even friendship in the Summa. I choose to use the word affability just to kind of distinguish it from our modern conceptions of friendship and show that it's, you know, it bears similarities to it, but it's distinct in important ways.
Thank you. Other questions? Yep.
So you said that Thomas Aquinas does not aim too low or too high. Mm-hmm. Would it be reasonable to say that because in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, you have like a spectrum where there's a mean and there's an excess and there's a deficiency. Mm-hmm. Could affability be viewed as a mean between an excess or a deficiency? I don't know what the excess or the deficiency is. I might not have paid close enough attention to it.
Well, I mean, technically speaking, it's a mean in between. It's a mean when it comes to pleasing others. So he writes about the excess is flattery, where you're pleasing somebody no matter what. Basically, you know, you're telling them what they want to hear. You know, I argue in my paper that for you know, political staffers and politicians on a certain side, you know, they don't say anything bad about the people on their side. They don't criticize them. They praise them and to an excessive degree try to please them. But then on the other side, the deficiency is quarreling, where someone just wants to be a jerk and not please at all in any instance. And so technically speaking, affability is a mean between those two extremes, where you're trying to please people and be pleasant towards them as appropriate, but not, you know, when they're committing a sin or an injustice. But yeah, I guess in another sense, insofar as I'm setting it in between kind of a robust civic friendship, which I think is, you know, too high of a standard, versus like a mere civility, I think it is a mean in that regard too, but that's not exactly something that Aquinas would argue.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I think it was a really compelling argument. I have kind of two unrelated clarification questions. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned how affability doesn't have the same binding quality as justice, but you also mentioned that man owes like a principle of like equity to each other. Can you clarify the distinction between like a binding quality and something that's owed? And that's my first question. And then my second question is kind of unrelated, but it's you made the point that affability creates social environment where true friendship can flourish. I was just wondering if you can like parse out how it does this. How does it create that environment, and what does that environment look like?
Those are great questions. I have like one paragraph in my paper about the distinctions between justice and affability, and I probably need to flesh that out a little bit more. I think justice is sort of the comprehensive binding virtue that requires one to give to another his or her due. I think affability has like less teeth to it, if you think of it that way. It's less of it's less binding. Yeah, it's less required. It's more like liberality. Like it's nice for people to act in this way, but society is not going to punish them if they don't act in this way. So in that way, I'm arguing that it kind of falls short of what justice does. It doesn't have as much kind of a binding quality. It doesn't have the teeth that justice has. But it also kind of, similar to liberality, it kind of goes beyond what's required of justice and allows us to enjoy society as it ought to be enjoyed to a greater degree. I don't know if that helps, and I think this is something that I probably need to unpack a little bit further myself. Does that help? Okay, and your second question was?
How does it create?
Oh, yeah.
Create a social environment where friendship flourishes. I'm just wondering how it does that.
Yeah, this is sort of implicit in Aquinas' thought, and it's there's an article that I cite where the authors explicitly make this argument. But I think we can think of it as, public, how we engage publicly is always going to bleed into our private lives, and also the social framework in which we live is inherently going to affect our private relationships and our own virtue. So, we're not atomistic individuals who aren't affected by those around us. And we're also not divided beings who have a personality on social media and one with our families. And it's okay if those are completely divided. Like there's always bleed in between those two different identities. So I think Aquinas would just say that, one, a society in which the virtue of affability is practiced, a friendly society, you're going to be more likely to make private friendships in a society where people aren't like being a jerk to you out on the street or at the grocery store. A general friendliness is going to conduce to deeper human attachments. I think that's just, all of us could kind of think about our human experience. You're more likely to become a friend with your grocery store checkout person if they're like, hey, how are you doing today? Did you find everything that you needed? Versus if they're like, getting you through there, like you're wasting my time. And then for us personally, I think we're too often dividing ourselves between a public persona, maybe a social media persona where we're being a jerk with people who we don't know, strangers out there, and then think this isn't going to affect me privately. I'm still going to be a good friend, father, husband, etc. But I think Aquinas would reject the bifurcation of ourself and say that inevitably your public behavior is going to impact who you are privately as well.
Oh, we probably only have time for one more question. I saw that hand first. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for your talk. So Aquinas says that we're social creatures and that we will naturally tend to be sort of pleasant and affable towards one another. Does that mean that in a situation like what we have in this country, where there's a severe lack of those virtues, and you see lots of polarization, that something has gone seriously wrong with the polity itself, or is that not necessarily the case?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think one, it's sin. So he obviously understands that human sin affects our inclinations, both rationally and our ability for our will to kind of choose the good. So sin has always made it more difficult for us to follow through on our natural inclinations. But I think you would also say that laws and social customs and all these things help form and guide human behavior toward the good, can reinforce our natural inclinations or push us in the opposite direction away from how we're naturally inclined. So yeah, I think certainly we're always going to be tempted to not follow to not pursue the good. But I think in societies like our own, where there's a lot of just kind of social pressures and, you know, in order to get a bunch of likes on social media, you kind of need to be a jerk and say spicy, fiery things. Otherwise, you're just going to be like me, a no-name person who has like a tweet every decade and no one cares what they say. So there are kind of social customs that either encourage or discourage moral behavior as well. So I think that could be another paper that maybe you want to write about how our society encourages unaffable behavior.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to move quickly so that Stephen gets his time, but that was terrific. I had similar thoughts about, well, how do we operationalise this? How do we train people to have those? Because if it's a virtue, it requires training and habit. And is it possible to do that without a fully orbed account like yours made public? I hope to see this published in a popular form as well as in a scholarly way. Our next speaker is Stephen Waldorf. He's an assistant professor in the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America. His research focuses on medieval and early modern political philosophy in the scholastic tradition, with an emphasis on topics including natural law, relations between church and state, and the source of political authority. And this afternoon, his paper is entitled The Conditional Character of Consent in Aquinas' Theory of Political Authority, which I think matches really well the paper that we just heard. So I'm really looking forward to this. Please, thanks, Steve.
Well, thank you all for being here for the last paper of the last session of the last day. I very much appreciate it. So my presentation this afternoon focuses on the question of what for Aquinas is the source of legitimate governing authority. And by that question, I mean, how does one individual or group of individuals come to hold legitimate governing authority over others? And not the distinct question of whether political authority must derive in a more ultimate sense from natural law, which I think for Aquinas it does. Now, according to the historically dominant interpretation, Aquinas believes that the conferral of governing authority must be traceable to the consent of the people. This view is held by scholars including Yves Simon, Jacques Maritain, Thomas Gilby, Charles McCoy, Mark Murphy, among others. While these scholars differ on questions such as whether every legitimate government has to be instituted by consent or only a community's original form of government, all would agree that rightful authority must be traceable in some way back to an act of popular consent. Now, the alternative interpretation holds that governing authority resides by nature in certain individuals, namely those who are wiser and more virtuous than others and thus more capable of promoting the common good. Legitimate authority inheres in these individuals because of their moral excellence, and it doesn't have to be conferred upon them by an act of popular consent. And Samuel Beer is the principal proponent of this view. So Thomas Varacalli has recently proposed a kind of hybrid interpretation between these two positions. He agrees that for Aquinas, legitimate governing authority must be traceable to popular consent in most circumstances. However, he claims that Aquinas carves out an important exception to this rule, namely the case of a corrupt democracy. In democratically governed states, when the people become morally legitimate, they ipso facto lose the right to elect the rulers. This right passes automatically to the few remaining virtuous citizens in the polity who then elect new rulers. The governing authority of these new rulers thus derives ultimately from the possession of virtue by a select group of citizens, independently of popular consent. And in the case of corrupt democracies, and in this case alone, legitimate authority is not traced back to popular consent, but ultimately to the claims of moral virtue. Consent is thus conditional, in other words, upon the people's moral state. In my remarks today, I will assess this interpretation. And let me preface by saying that I share Varacalli's view and that of many other scholars that the conferral of legitimate authority ordinarily must be traceable back to consent, and that it is not in general conferred by the possession of virtue like beer holds. The issue I address here is whether, as Veracali believes, the case of corrupt democracy is an exception to this rule. Now, his interpretation turns entirely on a reading of Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae 97.1, since this is the only text really where Aquinas explicitly addresses this question of authority in a corrupt democracy. It's a passage that's received comparatively little attention from scholars on Aquinas' political thought, and Veracali's examination is the principal treatment of it in the scholarly literature. And while I think he's certainly right to bring it to our attention as an important passage for scholarship on Aquinas' theory of political authority, I don't think that his interpretation is ultimately sustainable. When read properly, Prima Secundae 97.1 does not suggest that the authority of the rulers who take power in a corrupt democracy derives from the moral excellence of the few remaining virtuous citizens in the polity. Rather, as I will show, their authority is still traceable back to an act of popular consent. And the case of corrupt democracy is thus not an exception to Aquinas' what I think to be otherwise consistent teaching that legitimate governing authority must ordinarily be traceable to consent. Now, the key interpretive claim I advance to support my thesis is that according to 97.1, in corrupt democracies, the people do not lose their right to elect rulers solely on account of their moral vice, and the virtuous remnant do not acquire this right solely on account of their virtue. On the contrary, Aquinas' claim in the passage is that when the citizens become vicious, their elected legislators should pass a law transferring the right to elect rulers to the virtuous remnant. And the new rulers, those who are elected by the virtuous few, thus trace their authority back not to possession of virtue by a select group, but rather to a legislative act of the people's representatives, and therefore ultimately to the people who elected these representatives and invested them with legislative authority. Now, to see this, let's consider the text. So 97.1, which is on the handout, and if you don't have a copy, you might grab one. 97.1 addresses whether human law should ever be changed, and Aquinas answers by claiming that there are two occasions when it is justifiable to change a law. The first is when reason discovers that an existing law is considered in itself less conducive to the common good than some potential alternative. For instance, over the course of time, human reason might discover that certain political institutions are, as a general matter, better adapted to the common good than currently existing institutions, and in such circumstances, a change of laws to adopt the better institutions would be warranted. The second occasion when a change of laws is justifiable is when the subjects of a law undergo a change of condition, such that a law which advanced the common good in their former state no longer does so in their altered state. Here, the reason for the change is not a defect intrinsic to the law itself, but rather an alteration in the condition of the people. And the example that Aquinas gives of when a change of law is appropriate due to the changed condition of the subjects is the key passage that, according to Veracali, establishes that in corrupt democracies, governing authority need no longer be traceable to popular consent, but can instead have its source in the possession of virtue. And this is the passage on the handout, and I think it's worth reading. So Aquinas writes, "On the part of man whose acts are regulated by law, the law rightly can be changed on account of a change of the condition of man, to whom different things are beneficial according to his different conditions." Augustine poses an example of this in De Libero Arbitrio 1, namely that if a people is quite moderate and serious and a most diligent guardian of the common good, a law permitting such a people to choose for themselves magistrates through whom the republic is governed is rightly brought in. If afterwards the same people should little by little become depraved, selling their votes and committing governance to dissolute men and criminals, the power of choosing rulers is rightly taken away from such a people and returns to a few good men. Unquote. So according to Vericalli, citing the example from Augustine here, Aquinas is saying that when a people ceases to be virtuous, it ipso facto loses the right to elect rulers. He writes that when a people becomes morally legitimate, they, quote, have no right to choose their magistrates and leaders, and he says that their consent ceases to be, quote, necessary for legitimacy. The prerogative of choosing rulers instead passes to the virtuous remnant because they're virtuous. In such cases, the legitimate rulers are those whom the virtuous remnant elect, and since the virtuous remnant acquire the right to elect the rulers on account of their own virtue, it follows that the new ruler's authority is traceable to the claims of moral virtue independent of popular consent. And the derivation of the new ruler's governing authority, and according to Vericalli's interpretation, is what's shown in diagram 1 on the handout. Now, the problem with this interpretation is that the passage does not, in fact, claim that the transfer of the right to elect rulers from the people to the virtuous is automatic, something that occurs solely on account of the people's moral deterioration. Rather, the transfer is the result of a change of laws by a legislative act of a human lawgiver. This is clear, I think, from the very context of the passage. The question posed in 97.1 is not how political authority is actually lost or gained, but rather when is a change of laws justifiable? Aquinas' claim that the right of choosing rulers is rightly taken away from the people and conferred upon the virtuous remnant is cited as an example of the second occasion when it is justifiable to change a law, namely when the condition of the subjects changes. This implies that the transfer of the right to elect leaders that's envisaged in the passage is a legislative act. It's a substitution of one statute with another. For Aquinas, a legislative act requires a lawgiver to perform the act. As he says, quote, the making of a law belongs either to the whole people or to a public personage who has care of the whole people, since in all other matters the directing of anything to the end concerns him to whom the end belongs, unquote. So civil law is never introduced or changed automatically, for example, solely on account of the fact that the people is no longer virtuous. It's rather the product of a human legislator's activity. And thus, by citing the transfer of the right to elect rulers from the people to the virtuous remnant as an example of when law should be changed because of a new condition in the subjects, Aquinas' point is that in such a case, a human legislator is justified in passing a new statute. His point is not that the right to elect rulers passes ipso facto from the people to the virtuous remnant because of the people's moral corruption. Now, the fact that the people's corruption does not by itself deprive them of the right to choose rulers is, I think, further confirmed by the letter of the passage itself. So Aquinas, as you can see, speaks of when authority is rightly taken away, recte adimitur. The inclusion of rightly suggests that he is discussing the circumstances under which the people's ability to elect their own rulers should be taken away. To say that this right should be taken away does not imply that it actually is taken away. On the contrary, to say that the right to elect rulers should be taken away from citizens suggests that the removal of this right is contingent on the intervention of a human agent who sees what should happen and changes the laws accordingly. The key question then becomes, who are the legislators who pass the law transferring to the virtuous remnant the right of electing the rulers? Clearly, it would have to be the legislators in office at the time of the people's moral decline, because nobody else would have the authority at this point to change the laws. Now, based on the chronology envisaged in 97.1, these legislators would be the people's elected representatives, since at the time of the people's moral decay, the community is being governed by popularly elected lawmakers. And therefore, it's these elected representatives who, seeing the citizens' moral deterioration, pass a law removing from them the right to choose the rulers and giving it to the virtuous. The new ruler's governing authority is thus traceable back to a legislative act of the people's representatives, and by implication to the people themselves, who voluntarily invested these individuals with lawmaking authority. And this chain of transmission of authority that I'm sketching for you is graphed in diagram 2 on the handout. So corrupt democracy is therefore not a case in which rulers ultimately possess governing authority due to moral virtue independently of a community's consent. On the contrary, it's a case where governing authority is traceable precisely to popular consent as its source. Now, two objections to my interpretation might be raised, and I think it's important to address them. The first is that Aquinas claims in 97:1 that the power to appoint new rulers is transferred from the people to the virtuous remnant once the people become corrupt and commit governance to dissolute men and criminals. The statement implies that by the time the law is changed, transferring the right to choose rulers to the virtuous, the people's elected representatives are already corrupt. And if the legislators themselves are corrupt, how could they be expected to effectively confer on the virtuous the right to replace them with new rulers? I would agree that it is unlikely for corrupt legislators to do something like that. But I don't think that my position is committed to holding this admittedly implausible position. Why? Because the passage never says that by the time the law is changed, these corrupt legislators constitute a majority. On the contrary, they may still constitute a minority. I think we're entitled to assume that in order to help make better sense of the passage. So I don't think my position is committed to this implausible claim. Now, the second objection is that someone might say, well, it makes little sense to claim that a legislative act removing the people's power to appoint rulers could actually be said to be traceable to popular consent, even if it were performed by the people's representatives. Presumably, the citizens wouldn't want to lose their right to elect the government and wouldn't consent to the transfer. In fact, such an act might even seem to constitute what Aquinas in the Sentences commentary calls violent usurpation, which is the seizure of power from unwilling subjects. It's something that he claims is illegitimate. The problem with this objection is that it presupposes that a law disfavored by the majority, basically an unpopular law, can't be said to have its source in popular consent, and that it's instead imposed on the subjects unwillingly. There are, though, many laws which, though unpopular, we would not say are implemented contrary to the people's consent. So, for example, a tax increase passed by a legislature may very well be unpopular, but we wouldn't say that that's a usurpation. The only case in which we might say it's a usurpation is if the legislative authority that the people gave to their rulers did not extend to passing the tax increase. And by analogy with the claim that I'm making, the only way that the law transferring away from the people the right to elect rulers would constitute usurpation that's not traceable to popular consent is if the people didn't give the lawmakers, if the authority, in other words, with which the lawmakers are invested doesn't include the power effectively to abolish popular elections. And Aquinas doesn't say that. And so the transfer of the right to elect rulers to the virtuous remnant, though perhaps unpopular, can still be traced, I think, to popular consent, inasmuch as it's implemented through lawmaking authority conferred by citizens on the legislators. So in conclusion, Prima Secundae 97.1 does not suggest, I think, that corrupt democracy is a case in which rulers cease to derive their authority from the people, but instead come to derive it from the claims of moral virtue. And it's therefore consistent with other passages in which Aquinas does suggest that the possession of governing authority ordinarily has its source in popular consent rather than virtue, in passages I discuss at greater length in the paper. I do want to add, though, that this does not mean that political authority as such originates in the will of the people, as in social contract theory. On the contrary, though the possession of legitimate authority by any particular individual has to be traceable back to an act of consent, investing that person with authority on the part of the citizens, this is not authority's ultimate source. Natural law, whose author is God, is in fact the ultimate source of political authority for Aquinas. By the law of nature, we are inclined to enter into political society in order to realize our end of virtuous living. Moved by this inclination, we come together to form a polity, and we designate somebody through an act of consent to make laws on behalf of the community that will enable us all to live virtuously. Though the possession of legitimate authority by any given person has to be traceable to this act of consent, This is only because by the natural law, we just simply, by default, have to choose somebody who's going to look after the good of the whole community if we're going to achieve our end of virtuous living. So consent, therefore, does not stand as an independent and ungrounded fount of authority, as you would find articulated in Hobbes, for example. Rather, choosing a ruler through consent is simply a necessary means by which we fulfill our natural law obligation to seek the virtuous life. And it's precisely because the establishment of a government through consent is necessary to fulfill the natural law that a ruler's claim to legitimate authority has to be traceable to it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Great presentation. Questions? Great.
Thank you. Please correct me if this is kind of like a question from my own ignorance, but I'm kind of aware of within Thomistic scholarship that the rights-based language is not something that's necessarily found in Thomas Aquinas, and I noticed in the passage that it doesn't say the word right, but rather the power of choosing rulers. Mm-hmm. So I was kind of wondering why you chose to use the word right, if there's distinction between a right and this power mentioned in the passage, or how does like the translation work?
Thank you. That's a good question. So, I mean, the question would be, what by right, I'm meaning a rightful power, a morally legitimate power. And there actually is another instance in his text where he talks about the right, the use of a multitude to choose its rulers. And it's in De Regno, Book 1, Chapter 6, either paragraph 49 or 50, in which he says it belongs either to the jus multitudinus, that is to say the right of the multitude to choose the rulers, or to the right of what he calls a superior authority. And in the paper, I talk a little bit more about what he means by superior authority. I think it's very clear based on the example he gives that it's someone who has acquired jurisdiction over a polity through victory in just war. And that would be the only case barring divine appointment, as in the case Aquinas thinks of Moses in the Old Testament, but not much outside of that, in which an individual's possession of political authority wouldn't have to be derived from consent. But the point that I'm arguing is that there's no case in which moral virtue alone is ever the source of an individual's possession of authority, whether generally, as a lot of other scholars would hold, but also in this particular case of corrupt democracy. So you're right, the passage doesn't use the word right, but I think that's kind of what he's getting at, particularly based on that other passage in De Regno.
Other questions? Yep.
Stephen, thank you for your interesting presentation. Is this overturning of an illegitimate and corrupt government by the virtuous few based on natural law? Because it's probably against positive law, the laws of election, and or where is it founded?
Well, so my point, I think my argument is that it's actually not contrary to positive law, because it would be illegitimate, and this comes out, I think, in a number of texts on tyrannicide, for example, in which Aquinas rules out anyone but the multitude from removing authority even from a tyrant. Now, we can obey or disobey unjust particular laws, but that doesn't mean that the tyrant loses his authority because he's become bad, or even for the mere fact that he's issued bad laws. And so I think the possession of legitimate authority actually isn't dependent upon, for Aquinas, whether one follows natural law. I mean, we are obliged to disobey intrinsically unjust laws, but again, that doesn't mean for him that the ruler loses authority ipso facto. And what I'm claiming is going on here in 97.1 is that in order to be legitimate, the new government in a corrupt democracy would have to be instituted by people who received the power to institute that government from the people's representatives. And so it is a procedural matter. It's not natural law as such legitimizing the overturning of the corrupt democracy. And I think the implication, frankly, is that if people were to take it into their own hands and overturn the corrupt democracy by themselves, solely appealing to the natural law, that would be illegitimate, I think, for Aquinas. And I would base that on a lot of the texts in tyrannicide that you find in Senate's Commentary 244. You find it in De Regno 6, right around actually 49 to 50, and a number of other places. So does that clarify?
Yeah, thank you.
I actually have a question. Sure. It's almost like a comment a little bit. My mind goes to, I think it's Article 96.4, or is it 95.4, where he discusses Isidore's classification of laws, and he's working with Roman law categories, and I rather suspect that's significant in the context of your argument too. And he suggests, it seems, that there are different types of laws that come from different types of regime, Aristotelian regimes, right? Aristocratic, oligarchic, democratic, but not tyrannical, actually. So that a tyrant actually doesn't produce law. A king does, a monarch does. So part of the question might be around, when he's referring to law in this passage, is he picking up all of those categories or not? Because the interesting thing is that towards the end of, I think it's 96 or 95.4 or something.
Is this the Isidore
bit?
Yeah.
He seems to idealise, like Aristotle and himself, the mixed constitution, and says, the best type of law is one where something, it's quite interesting Latin as far as I can gauge, is approved by the elders and the commons or something. A little bit like looking like a legislative, sort of the emerging legislative process in the nascent legislatures of the time. And so perhaps that then links to this idea that the law is coming from the people. But the difficulty might be for your argument that he's acknowledging these other types of laws unless there's some normative strength to this second type. Or the alternative might be that within Roman law, you probably know, there is that idea about the rulers got their authority initially from the people. So maybe that would align with your argument.
Well,
that
I
it's
think that
ultimately
is
from the people, and maybe that's where the answer lies. It's a comment question.
Yeah, I think that is his view, and there probably is some background in Roman law to it. The other thing that I think is motivating this more procedural take on the source of authority in Aquinas is, or at least how a given individual comes to possess authority, is Romans chapter 13. Why? Because in Romans chapter 13, there's an acknowledgement that the power that even unjust rulers has comes from God. And you find another affirmation of this in 2 Peter that he quotes in De Regno. And if you're going to say that power simply passes away from people because they're no longer virtuous, and thus the saints or the holy people, the virtuous people can therefore topple the regime and take power, that's awfully hard to square with Romans 13. And so I think that's in the background is something motivating. I mean, I think it's both the Roman law, you're right, and I think it's also because of the influence of Romans, which suggests that there's not a strict correlation between promotion of the common good, virtue, and legitimate authority. And in terms of the question about the classification of laws in Isidore that you're referring to, I mean, I think here, it is just, he's talking about just the case of the corrupt democracy here. Is it even really a tyranny at this point? I'm not sure. I don't think it would be, because a tyranny is going to be ruled by one. I mean, he seems to be suggesting that there's, well, obviously the lawgivers are still elected at this point in the chronology, right? And yeah, he doesn't indicate that a tyrant has yet emerged here. So I mean, I'm not sure that tyranny is really at issue. Does that clarify? Do you want to follow up, and I can clarify more?
It's more that I think that perhaps I'm just, I suppose, suggesting that to enrich your argument, engaging with that and thinking through how your argument might be made consistent, a consistent interpretation of those other passages would in one way address a potential objection, but it doesn't mean it knocks down your argument, because there might be a way of interpreting, and I think there might be, that is consistent with your argument.
And could you maybe just articulate the
Well,
objection a little bit?
Well, because these other categories of law don't derive from the people. They're categories of law that derive in regimes in an Aristotelian sense that are pure aristocracy, pure oligarchy, as well as democracy or pure monarchy, because he then distinguishes that from a mixed constitution where it's coming from mixture.
Right. I see. Oh, I see.
And
Okay.
you see,
Yep,
yeah.
I
So
do. I would-
what sort of law is this?
Well, I think that
And if monarchies exist on their own without the people, then it contradicts your argument.
Right, I
But
see
you
what
might
you're
have an
saying. Okay.
answer to that ultimately the
I
monarchy
do
comes
actually.
from.
Yeah. So no, thank you for clarifying. So I think that whether it was an aristocracy, a monarchy, an oligarchy, at some point the grant of authority would have to be traced back at maybe several levels of remove, back to an initial act of popular consent. And Aquinas does say, for example, in De Regno, that a people can alienate. Well, he doesn't use the word alienate. What he says is that a people can confer authority on a ruler in perpetuity, right? So presumably some kind of a monarchy. But the monarch's authority is therefore still something that if you go back far enough, you're going to find some initial act of consent. And my point is that what you could never have for Aquinas, I think, is a chain of authority that at some point doesn't terminate back in popular consent. And so even those aristocratic, oligarchic, monarchical laws that you're referring to, I think somehow are for him going to have to be traced back to an act of popular consent, in as much as those rulers at some point back in history got it from an initial act of community consent. So thank you for clarifying that.
That's good. I'm sorry, as a chair, I shouldn't have taken up so much. Any other questions before we finish? We've sort of gone over time slightly. Let's thank Stephen.
All right, well, thank you all.